Welcome back to CHR305 Christian Worldview. This is lecture 11, and today we're going to be looking at the dynamics of war and peace. Let me show you a video produced by a very controversial author and activist. His name is Shane Claiborne, and what he has to say about war may bristle some of your sensitivities.
Yeah, I lived in Baghdad during the shock and awe campaign and during the bombing of Baghdad, and I saw some of the most horrific things that I've ever seen. And I think that is one of the great the tragedies in our world right now is that we don't see all of the destruction that was part of what was so powerful about being in Iraq is I wasn't just watching the news, no offense, but I was actually I went to the Amaria shelter, which was filled with 400 women and children when two smart bombs fell on the roof of it. And I could see the marks in the walls from their fingernails as they tried to get out. Now, I think if some of the leaders of our country could have been in the Almeria shelter, like some of the decisions that were made might be different. But it's that divide, I think, that we don't have the human encounter anymore. And it's that which is I mean, I think just hurting so many of the soldiers in the militaries. I have a pile of letters on my desk from soldiers over and over that are crying out, and the suicide rate in the military right now is at an astronomical high. And I have kids that are telling me things like the things that they've seen and how it haunts them, and they feel like, especially the ones that are trying to follow Jesus, they're like, I have no way to reconcile what I'm doing and what I'm seeing. I'm dying and killing for abstract nouns like democracy and freedom, but it just doesn't feel like Jesus. And so, to me, that's there's so many that are dying from this myth of redemptive violence, that's out there. But even in a case like Hitler, I think that Bonhoeffer, when he planted, when they planned for the assassination of Hitler, Bonhoeffer said something really, really interesting. He said, "Now don't let anybody applaud what I'm doing or think that it's noble. I mean, what I'm doing is a sin." And he said, "I just don't know what else to do." Now that's very different, I think, than going forth with sort of the triumphal, God blessing, baptizing bombs. A lot of what we've heard and thinking that this is God's will or something. I think even Bonhoeffer was wrong. And there's an interview with with Hitler's secretary in a movie called Blind Spot, and she tells about when the assassination attempt failed, and Hitler was sort of very interestingly like protected from the bomb. He was convinced at that point, more than ever before, that God was protecting him and his mission, and he went forward with renewed vigilance like never before. And so I would say on the day that Bonhoeffer did that, the cross lost. And that violence just perpetuated. Now, where the church should have been in Hitler and in Hitler's Germany and in the genocide in Rwanda and all of these horrific things, so many of them have been done because of really, really terrible theology. Hitler had the Bible in his hand, and he was saying, just as Jesus cleansed the temple of the Jews, I am cleansing the world of this Jewish poison. And like he had this skewed theology. The Ku Klux Klan had the Bible in hand when they were lynching African Americans. And in Rwanda during the genocide, probably one of the most horrific events in our lifetime, where 100 people were dying every hour from machetes, 1 million people in 100 days. 90% of Rwanda was Christian. And yet their tribal identities trump their Christianity, and we get skewed in who we are. And it's that kind of really bad theology that gets people killed.
Okay, I don't know about you, but Claiborne's comments raise a lot of questions for me. The first one would be this: if violence comes from bad theology, does that necessarily mean that violence can never arise from good theology or right belief? Could right belief ever lead us to fight for a good cause? Is that possible? Secondly, Claiborne points out what he calls the myth of redemptive suffering. And I have to ask, is redemptive suffering always a myth? Can it not somehow be real? In fact, it seems at the cosmic level that when we look at Jesus on the cross, that in a sense that was redemptive violence, that God was executing violence on his own son, that Jesus was enduring the violent wrath of God on sin so that sinners could be redeemed. I think this is redemptive suffering, redemptive violence. So, thirdly, in conclusion, can we always say that all violence is wrong? Can violence be justified in any way? Well, here we are in the Christian, looking from the Christian worldview, trying to gain perspective on the idea of war. Essentially, Christians generally take one of two positions on war, even though clearly there's some variation among them. The first position would be similar to what you just heard from Claiborne, and it would be called passivism. Passivism makes a few claims. It denies that there is ever any moral justification for killing, and thus there is no justification for the lethal force in warfare. So even if a nation is attacked and overtaken, the proper Christian response would be love and peaceful, non-violent demonstration. All violence is evil, regardless of the good it hopes to achieve, and so non-violence is always right, regardless of the situation. This is essentially Christian passivism. Advocates throughout history include, some would say, Jesus. He non-violently and without resistance went to the cross, that he did not fight back. Others would say that they aren't sure that Jesus fits into this category because he was violent when he drove people from the temple. Martin Luther King Jr. was nonviolent and pacifist in his approach to civil rights. In fact, that's what made the civil rights movement so powerful, is that the participants in it refused to become violent. They just maintained very peaceful demonstration. Stanley Hauerwas is a contemporary ethicist and a theologian at Duke University, and he maintains a pacifist position from a Christian worldview. Early church fathers, such as Tertullian and Origen, were against Christians participating in war, but they weren't necessarily against war per se. They felt that war was probably sometimes necessary, but that Christians should not partake in war. Several Bible references are used by pacifists to support their position, and I'll highlight just a couple here. In Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says things like, "Turn the other cheek, love your enemies." Romans chapter 12, Paul says, do not repay evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. Do not take personal revenge. Leave vengeance to the Lord. And then we have the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when the soldiers come to arrest him. Peter takes out a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers, and Jesus heals the man and tells Peter to put away his sword. All of these seem to corroborate the position of Christian pacifism. There is, however, another side, another position. This is just war theory. The theory that there can indeed at times be a just war if it meets certain criteria under certain conditions. Just war theory holds that violence and killing are indeed tragic, but sometimes it is necessary in an evil world to fight against evil with force. Tyranny must be checked, evil must be restrained, and peace must be maintained, and often doing these things requires force. Just war theory has dominated Western philosophy and Christian thinking for centuries now. There are non-Christian advocates of just war theory. In ancient times, those would include Plato, a Roman philosopher, and Cicero, philosophers. Christian advocates include Augustine, who in some sense is the father of just war thinking, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Grotius, and John Locke. Really, to understand just war theory, you have to understand it in its two main aspects. First, just war theory seeks to construct rules governing the decision of a civil authority to go to war, to engage in warfare. The second aspect is that just war theory constructs rules governing a country's conduct in warfare, how it behaves itself during the war. Let's look at these one at a time. First, rules governing the decision to fight. First of all, there must be a just cause. There must be a good reason to go to war. Just causes may include maintaining peace or justice, self-defense, the defense of a neighbor, restoring peace, the protection of life, or the restoration of human rights. In addition to a just cause, there should be a just intent, what you intend to do during warfare. You should intend not to inflict great harm, to punish, or humiliate. Not those things. Instead, your intent should be to secure and maintain peace. Just cause, just intent, and last resort. All attempts at peaceful resolution should have been exhausted before resorting to war. War should always be a last measure. A competent authority. War should only be carried out once it has been authorized by a competent civil authority. For example, in the United States, only an act of Congress can formally declare war. We should not gather around ourselves just a group of people and decide to go declare war on other nations. And frankly, this is the problem of terrorism in the 21st century, is that war is no longer being carried out by competent authorities, but by random bands of people. Just war theory holds that revolution, which would be an uprising among the people to overturn its own government, that generally speaking, revolution is not legitimate, but in certain extreme circumstances, it is legitimate if the government ceases to carry out its proper function. A just war must have the weight of justice on its side. The one declaring war must believe that justice is on the side of the one conducting the war. And we should have proportionate objectives. The good that we hope to achieve in the war must outweigh the cost and the losses suffered. Finally, probability of success. That we should not conduct a war in futility. If it's obvious that we will not win this war, then what is the point in fighting the war? So those are, generally speaking, the rules that govern the decision to go to war, the decision to fight. Let's talk now about rules that govern conduct during war. How should combatants behave during warfare? First, there is the principle of proportionality, that the use of force should be limited to what is necessary to secure the objectives. In other words, let's only use force to the extent that we can get the job done. Let's not be excessive in our use of force. Principle of proportionality. Then there is the principle of discrimination. The principle of discrimination claims that there should be no direct intentional attacks on non-combatants. Attacking civilians and non-military targets is prohibited. There is the prohibition of abuse. There should be no execution of prisoners, no rape, no human shields, no plundering, no terrorism, no desecration of holy places or destruction of national monuments. Warring parties should seek to fight in good faith, to conduct a fair fight. The probability of success should be in view. If the objectives cannot be achieved, if a nation at war realizes that it cannot possibly win the war, then it should stop fighting and the war should be abandoned. Usually this occurs when one side surrenders to the other and seeks a treaty or seeks a truce. There is biblical support for just war theory. Just war theorists look to several places. I'll list some, but really only discuss two. Romans chapter 12 that we mentioned on the pacifist side encourages people not to take personal revenge, but to leave vengeance to God. I will repay, says the Lord. So we place vengeance in God's hands and we don't seek to take revenge on our own. But then in Romans 13, Paul claims that in fact God has given the government some authority, civil authority. In fact, the government bears the sword in order to maintain justice and hold back the tide of evil. And so it seems that bearing the sword doesn't mean much if it doesn't mean lethal force. So it seems in some sense that Romans 13 gives civil authorities, the civil government, the right to bear the sword, to use force in order to maintain peace and maintain justice. In Acts chapter 10, we have a very interesting passage where a centurion, a Roman centurion, becomes a believer, he becomes a Christian, but he remains a centurion. He is not in any way required to give up his position in the military. And so perhaps in the early church, this tension was not there, that they were fine with a person being in the military and being a Christian. So generally speaking, these are the two big perspectives on war and peace. First you have pacifism, and then you have just war theory. And that is the end of Lecture 11.